Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today, I'm delighted to be speaking with Jason Dorland. Jason, welcome.
Thanks very much for having me, Dan.
Delighted to have you on. Thank you so much for giving up some of your time. Exciting to be talking all things sports psychology and mental skills and mindset. But before we get started on that, I'd love to know a little bit about you and your work.
Yeah, sure. I think, like most of your guests, there's a sports background, obviously, and mine began as a teenage boy rowing for a rowing legend here in Canada, Neil Campbell, uh, two-time Olympian, Olympic gold medal coach, Order of Canada, and I was fortunate enough to have him as my high school coach, and so that sort of began the journey, if you will. From there, it was off to university, then out here to the west coast of Canada to train on the national team, and eventually land in the Canadian National Men's Aid in 1988 in Seoul as the defending Olympic champions from 1984. I was a new member to the crew along with four other guys, and on paper there was great expectation, but on the day of the final, it just did not come together, and we finished dead last in that race, and and that was a moment, right? 25 years of age, young, 25 years of age, and just didn't know how to manage that moment, right? Didn't have the tools, nor the perspective, and that began the journey of really transforming from a highly combative athlete into one that we refer to now as more of a holistic athlete. So where as a younger athlete, everything was about the physical piece, right? Just train harder, get bigger, get stronger. Um, where today, obviously it's all of it. It's the mental piece, it's the emotional piece, and for sure it's the physical. But there was so much about my training as a young athlete that I either didn't know about, didn't care, or just didn't know any better. And so here we are now today. After that sort of transformation, and I'm sure we'll get into it. My wife and I, Robyn Meagher, she a two-time Olympian herself, middle distance runner. We work with organizations and individuals around creating what we refer to as a healthy high performing culture. So one that doesn't mimic what I did, which was, kill or be killed, win at all costs, all that sort of stuff. And where her approach was more synergistic, run with your competitors as opposed to against them. And and I feel very fortunate to do the work we do today. It's really cool to help organizations discover that that combative method, although it works, is limited, and we very much enjoy our work. So.
Absolutely fascinating biography. And you talk about that combative, kill or be killed mindset. I mean, was that something that was within you, born within you? Do you think it was something that was cultivated? Was there a socialization back in the 80s around that combative approach? Yeah, could you sort of describe where that came from for you?
Yeah, I'll tell you, it wasn't. It wasn't my parents, I can assure you. My mom used to, post Olympics years after, we'd have some pretty in-depth conversations, and at one point she said, I didn't recognize who you'd become," and that was, that's hard to hear from your mom, right? So very much it was a socialization. I think it was very much a part of sport culture at the time, and I think to the same degree as today. But rowing was and remains a highly egoic sport. Although it's non uh, contact, it is still a raw kind of chest pounding, tough guy kind of sport because as the pundits like to say, it's about sitting in that pain cave, man cave, or whatever the hell they call it, where you have to endure a tremendous amount of pain, and I think many rowers wear that as a badge, and I certainly did. I had a very high erg score when I was a young rower, and I'd be lying if I said that wasn't a huge source of pride for me. But I think, yeah, the whole hate your competitor thing, that was a learned behavior. Uh, it was very much a part not only of the sport, but, and all respect to Neil, goodness, I loved him, and I'm always consider myself fortunate for what he taught me. But he was very much the John Wayne of rowing back then, right? It was a man's man, or he was a man's man, and so it was a tough guy endeavor. And you didn't want to be the weak guy. You wanted to be the tough guy, and that very much sort of weaved its way through the sport. It was a huge part of the sport.
It's interesting that you mentioned that that combative approach can work, and we can unpack and explore that throughout our conversation here. But returning to 1988, 1984, you said you were the defending champions. I know you didn't compete in 84, but to speak to your point there, if Neil Campbell was the head coach in 84, and I don't know if he was, you can confirm or deny.
He was, yep.
Right. So they were Olympic champions. So there was something that was working at that time that then subsequently went not so good in 88.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much. And, to your point, right, it does work. And we would never argue that it doesn't work.
Okay.
That combative approach, it does. The notion of getting a hate on before a race is a strategy, and it can inspire, it can motivate, it can energize. But as I've said many times before, it'll only take you so far, and it'll only sustain for so long.
Okay.
And for me, that was really the piece in my comeback after Seoul. I had a year-long endeavor to come back for the 1992 Olympics in Barcelona, and I even ramped it up even more. Right, I used to have a photograph of when we got back from Seoul. The front page of the Globe and Mail, which is our national newspaper, was a photograph of our eight slumped over our oars after the final, and the headline, "Canadians bomb out in Seoul," and then a very disparaging article about our crew. And fair enough, right? Canadians expected for us to repeat, and we didn't. And so I looked at that photograph and that headline every morning before practice, every afternoon before the second practice, and every evening before bed. And it was all about revenge and retribution, and proving that I was worthy of more. And wow, that was a powerful fuse, right? It worked intensely for about 6 months, and then it absolutely blew up, and
Yeah.
and I became a very angry young man, and it was just I mean, for self-preservation, I had to get out, so I did.
Uh, Again, and please excuse me for wanting to linger on this, because I just think it is so important. At staying in 1988 Seoul Olympics, an Olympics that holds a lot of fond memories for me. I'm somebody in my late 40s, and it was the first Olympics. I mean, I sort of vaguely remember 84, but 88 was one that really captured my imagination. So I love talking about the 88 Olympics. If I had been a fly on the wall in and around the Olympic Village, your team meetings, I mean, what kind of behaviours and messages would I have been seeing that's akin to the kind of approach that you're talking about here?
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing, Dan, is that I was not an outwardly aggressive guy. Like, if you met me,
Okay.
you wouldn't know that was my go-to sauce, right? It was a very quiet and inner process, just building up
Yeah.
rage on the starting line before we went out on the boat on the water. In those meetings, again, Neil was a very quiet coach. He wasn't a rah-rah guy. There was no garbage can kicking. There was nothing, right? It was just, but you understood. It was unspoken, In quiet conversations, sure, there might be some sort of F-bombs dropped and this and that and war and what have you, but or disparaging words about the Germans or the Italians or whoever. But it yeah, it wasn't a raw process. But like I said, it was just part of the culture. Culture. It was
Mm.
infused into the culture, and it was, I don't know. I guess you had a choice, but
Yes.
you'd be an outlier to not adapt that process.
I assume as much as anything, it's what was missing as well. So there was no sense of or no process to explore any kind of vulnerability, any kind of negative emotion.
Sure.
Obviously you were driven by negative emotion. You're explaining that, but just the unhelpful thoughts, emotions, feelings that you might have been experiencing that might be to the detriment of performance. You didn't have any outlet there.
Right. And we often joke in the presentations when I sort of began to watch Robyn perform, and when I met Robyn and was introduced to this highly non-combative approach, it was like, wow, how did you get so far thinking like that? And
What did that look like, Jason? What did you experience firstly
well,
seeing her?
we met in 1994, about a week before the Commonwealth Games here in Victoria,
Mm.
and Robyn had um, some health challenges through the year. She wasn't highly prepared, wasn't fit, wasn't expecting much. But she was going to go out and race the final of the women's 3000. And I just thought that was the stupidest idea. But she and her coach wanted to know how the training was going, and they figured the Commonwealth Games was a good place to find out. And I just thought, wow, this is going to not end well. So I show up, and at that week, the week prior, when I asked you, how are you going to do? Like, what are you expecting? I was expecting the answer, well, that's a stupid question. I'm going to go out there and I'm going to win this race, right? But that wasn't her answer at all. It was, I'm going to go out there and do my best. And I just thought, I didn't say anything at the time because I wanted a second date, but I just thought that was the weakest, lamest answer anyone could ever have offered. So she was a conundrum right from the get go. It was like, wow, you are different. And so I show up for the race and I watch them come out, and it's before the race. It's very different from rowing. There's introductions, there's lots of fanfare. Whereas rowing, I mean, there's no one at the starting gates except for the crews and the starters. And there's Robyn on the track, and she's hugging her competitors before the race, right? Wishing them well. And I'm thinking, this is not
Wow.
like, who are you? This is You're a freak of nature, because nobody that I've ever met at this level of sport has that kind of behavior before a sport. And anyway, sure enough, the race begins. She's tied for last for the opening laps of the race. And I'm thinking, this is, just step off the track, right? Just DQ, because this is going to get ugly. Um, and but she doesn't. Halfway through the lap, or through the race, lap 5, she passes a few runners, but they're 50 meters behind the lead runners, right? The other top Canadian, the top Brit at the time, the top Australian, and the top Kenyans, and Robyn just, I don't know, she just grows wings and off she goes. And with a couple of laps to go, she's in 4th position, and Canada's in 1st. So, if she passes one more person, that's a gold and bronze, which she does. Then she passes another person, gold and silver for Canada, and that's how it finishes. And it was and remains one of the most inspiring races I've ever watched. It was amazing, because I also knew the backstory. And when we talked about it in the years after, as I slowly had enough confidence to ask a little more sort of prickly questions, if you will. It really came down to Robyn embracing a synergy of racing. She used to say, Together we fly. That was her mantra. And she used to use Canadian geese as her metaphor, because geese fly in a V formation, not because they have to, but because they choose to. And there's a strategy behind that V formation. They can fly further and faster. And so Robyn ran together with her competitors. And she used to just say to me all the time, if we all run faster, we all run faster. And I couldn't argue that. And so I just, sort of go, ugh, damn, you're right. I can't push back on that because it makes sense. And so, that was really a moment for me, Dan, where I realized, wow, maybe I had it backwards.
When was that moment? Because I think this is really, really interesting. I suppose selfishly as a psychologist, I'm always wondering about those moments of change or that passage of time that engenders change. And it strikes me that from what you've said, that you experienced a degree of what we would call cognitive dissonance
Yeah,
in that
sure.
stadium that night, but you didn't necessarily have an underlying explanation for what you saw.
Right.
But then it took conversation. It took some time for this phenomenon to slightly to bed in, and for you to say, "Oh, there is a different approach here. There is a more, let's call it a more sophisticated approach that can potentially get outcomes." I'm assuming it was a passage of time more so than a sudden change of outlook.
Yes, for sure. And I think, from I think without knowing it at the time, Robin became, for lack of a better term, a project for me in terms of trying to figure out, wow, how does this high performance athlete, how does this jive? Because I had met numerous national team runners who were not like Robin. They were sort of cocky and full of bravado, and Robin was a complete outlier. And and so I just thought, man, how does she go to multiple Olympic Games? How does she land top 10 in the world year after year as a clean athlete? Explain this to me. And so that was it, right? It's just going to these track meets summer after summer, watching her compete on the world stage year after year, and just going, this isn't going away. It's this works. And when I think back to the day of the race, although my mind was, as you say, in cognitive dissonance, my emotional response to the race was tears. And so I found that really interesting, that although what my mind was seeing did not make sense, on an emotional level, I was touched by her performance because, like everyone in the stadium, I was caught up in the excitement of watching this athlete go from last to second. And it was just so, it was just so inspiring to watch that.
See, this is one of the reasons why, one of many reasons, one of the reasons why I was excited to speak to you is because of this experience that you had with your partner at the time, and who became your wife, and with relation to your own experience in your sport, and how that changed. And I think it's really, really fascinating, because when you take a step back and you look at this, you look at the helicopter viewpoint, and you really, really think about it, it does track, it does make sense from a psychological and from a biopsychological, or even a physiological perspective, or a psychosomatic perspective, to throw a few more long words in terms of when you are in that combative state. I mean, when I think of rowing, I still think of the enormous will it requires, but I also think of it being quite a highly technical sport. I mean, I remember listening to Sir Steve Redgrave speak about this, that it's quite a technical sport, that your technique is important. And when you're in that combative mode, what we know as sports psychologists is that that could be an optimal state to be in, as you've mentioned, but equally, it could be challenging to get your technique to stick and to execute your technique when your muscles tighten as a consequence of that combative mode, compare and contrast to Robyn, which, as you said, who's in that synergistic state of mind and not effortless, although she may have felt effortless, but just relaxed, a relaxed concentration, if you like. It makes inherent sense, doesn't it, that her performance thrived and flourished, whereas when we're over aroused, when we're too activated, we just can't get that technique to stick.
Yes, and you can correct me here if I'm wrong, but Robyn's state, for lack of a better term, was more conducive to a flow state performance,
Yeah,
where
absolutely.
because she was relaxed, enjoying the process, out there with people who she connected with, it was all conducive to her having her best performance on the day. Contrast that with me in a highly elevated, hate rage state, not conducive to flow state, right? I'm going to do this come hell or high water. There's no flow to be accessed. It's it's bumpy and ugly all the way down. And that's, I think, where, as I've said, that regret is a big word, but if there is some regret, I wish I had met Robyn, or at least understood her process long before I ever got on the national team, right? To realize that you just can't argue with that methodology.
No, and talking about methodology, I mean, the process that she had is so in tune with how so many of us in sports psychology, especially myself, work with the metaphor, the synergistic process, and the Canadian geese metaphor.
Right, right.
That pictorial metaphor is so powerful when you work with athletes on this stuff. And so, given a magic time machine, if you could go back, give us an idea of what you would do differently. And you can describe this I would love you to describe this in detail. What would it look like in terms of what you would be doing differently?
For myself as an athlete.
Yeah, absolutely. Going into that the Seoul Olympics, and when you were there, and when you were in the boat.
Right. And well, you know what? I've never, I've never answered that question. I think, well, I don't think. I know in our work, for example, we often speak with our clients, whether it's a large room full of people or one at a time. We focus on the being part of performance, not just the doing.
Okay.
And when I was a young athlete, there was no awareness of the being part. I didn't care, about the being part, right? And it was all about training harder. It was all about developing a better racing strategy. It was all the tangible bits.
Yeah.
Lift heavier weight, have a better diet, get more sleep. It was all of those tangible pieces. Whereas what I didn't consider was how I held myself and how I held my competitors. And I mean, if I'm honest, I was a jackass in terms of my relationships with others. Um, and that's an embarrassing reckoning, right? To think back to who that guy was.
With your
And
teammates as well?
I wouldn't, when I see how I treat people now, when I see how I work with our clients, when I see myself as a rowing coach in a second iteration of that guy, yeah, it just wasn't. It was a tough guy persona, right? And it was all egoic, and everyone else was playing the same game. And I mean, I have better conversations with the guys I rode with back then today than we ever did back then. And sure, age is going to do that for you. You can become more honest and more forthcoming, more vulnerable. But back then, it was all guarded, it was all protected, and we were all playing a role. And so I think back then, I would have adopted more of Robyn's approach. So much of what she was about was just running because she loved running. And I didn't row because I loved rowing. I rowed because I wanted an Olympic gold medal. Right? I wanted what I thought that would do for me. I wanted to feel worthy. I wanted to be good enough. All those things that so many athletes attach to the outcome. And then, and then the ones who win, who, when they wake up the next morning and have that moment of, ooh, yikes, nothing's changed here.
Yeah.
And, and I think that's, I think that's the acid test that takes the combative approach and says, this is a broken system because it's limited in its ability to motivate and take you across the finish line, but it's also limited post race, post games, post event, because it's built you up for this moment where you think winning is going to change your life for the better. And it might be like there's a glow period for sure where it's a day, a week, a month, but at some point, I mean, Michael Phelps is the poster child of that, right? You can't argue that if he had just won one more gold medal, he would have been okay. And I think that's the lie that as coaches, as a sport body, we perpetrate that lie. We continue that lie, and I think we do our athletes a tremendous disservice by not utilizing Robyn's approach. I mean, sure, she loved winning, but it wasn't the reason she stepped on the track. She loved the challenge of finding out what she was capable of and just what she could learn from each race.
There's so much richness to what you're saying, and as a sports psychologist listening to you, it makes me think of important psychological areas such as identity and meaning, perhaps obvious areas like the problem with fatigue and burnout and injury, exhaustion, the inability you mentioned after, being combative and how that impacts you after a race, the inability to be able to reflect appropriately intellectually on how you've just raced because you're so caught up in emotion. And as I said earlier, I feel that combative approach, as useful as it can be for some people some of the time, again, we're not denying that it can't work some of the time for some people in the right context. At the same time, it can prevent your technique from sticking, for example. I'm really interested to lean on your book, your coaching experience, because you're coming up with these rich ideas. You've written this book, Pulling Together. You are a coach. So what does this mean in terms of how you coach now, the messages you're giving your students? And is there a constant struggle against this so-called norm of this, as you put it,
Right,
combative approach?
right. Yeah, great question. I think for us, what we still run into that mindset in coaching,
Yeah.
right? And understandable, as coaches often say, the parents want to win, the schools want us to win. How can winning not be the focus? And
Yeah.
so they default to what they know, which is chase the win, a combative approach, yada yada. And I think the question that often intrigues them is that the place that I got to as a rowing coach was that what I decided was that I was going to transform the lives of the young athletes that I was working with through the sport of rowing. And whatever happened, happened. If we won, great. If we didn't, that's okay too. But the point of my coaching was to use all of the power that rowing can have as a transformative experience and allow athletes to go through that and on the other end of it be changed people, be different people for the better. Well, it turns out what's required to transform the life of a young athlete is what's required to build really high performing teams.
Mm.
They're the same thing. And so the result of that was that we won a lot of national championships. I was a very successful crew coach when I was coaching, and but it wasn't the goal, wasn't the purpose. When I was rowing, the purpose was period. In my evolution of eventually landing in my last sort of positions as a coach, that wasn't the focus. Although the parents still wanted it and the school still wanted it and the headmaster still wanted that, it wasn't my focus. It wasn't the conversation I was having with the athletes. It was Robyn's approach, right? We're going to go out there. We're going to have the best possible race we can on the day, and that's it.
Have the best possible race, have the best possible performance to get the best possible outcome.
Right.
But ultimately, your program, it sounds to me like it was twofold. There was a focus on, you could call it a performance process or a mindset, but also within that and outside of that, developing people.
You bet. And that isn't less ambitious. And that's the part, right?
Mm.
That often coaches go, oh, well, that's a soft approach, right? You're just trying to do your best. Well, I would welcome any naysayers to phone up the athletes who were in the crews that I coached and ask them if the training was any less intense. It's not like we didn't work hard or that we didn't strategize optimally.
Yep.
Not at all. It's just that the focus was on doing the best that crew could possibly do on the day, given the training, given their ability, what have you. It was an intrinsic process, and they could measure the success of the performance. If they won, then beautiful. But if they didn't, you could still have your best race on the day.
The attitude, the philosophy, doing our best, striving for our best performance doesn't deserve the detail that you went into from a strategical perspective. It didn't deserve any kind of technical um, approaches that you were taking with your rowers. What it did deserve is maybe their experience of anxiety.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And yeah, I think when you put um, the outcome in the hands of the athletes, it empowers them as opposed to scaring the crap out of them,
Mm.
right? When they know that they're in control of their own process and that they will measure the success of this, you're right. It turns down the anxiety because they're no longer focused on the outcome. They're focused on the first stroke of the race and then the next stroke of the race and on and on and on. And I think where it becomes, I think where the beautiful part of this reveals itself is that, as you pointed out, best can be that can be a pretty high mark. There's a lot of Olympic medalists who win Olympic gold medals and don't have their best performance on the day. And so to strive for best is by no means the soft approach, if we're being honest about what best is.
Tell me about your book, Pulling Together, because I think we're talking about some really, really important concepts here that, I know many coaches are striving to get their head around and are willing to experiment and try new things. Tell me about Pulling Together.
Yeah, Pulling Together was an answer to my first book, which was Chariots and Horses. So Chariots and Horses was a tell-all of my Olympic experience, right? I originally wrote the book for me. I felt like I needed to figure out what the hell went wrong. And so it was like a really long journal entry. And then that eventually became a book. It was about, it was interesting when the book came out. I got letters and emails from athletes around the world saying, your story is my story. I'm not crazy. And I think it was the first time we saw a perspective of an athlete who went to Olympic Games, expected to win, and then didn't, and then crashed really hard. And so I captured all of that, and then met Robyn, came back to coaching as a different coach, and so Pulling Together was an ask from other coaches saying, crazy story, but how did you do that? And so I thought, well, I don't want to write a how-to book. I love telling stories. And so Pulling Together was a story with my methodology on the back of that story. So in my last coaching gig, which was at Ridley College in Ontario, which was my high school where I started rowing, which was kind of weird. um, we had a very successful run. And in fact, in 2014, the last crew that I coached, we came over to England for Henley as the favorite crew from North America. Without a spoiler here, we were training in Germany. We had a bike accident in Germany. It certainly compromised the crew, but we went to the regatta with our spare and we did what we could. And so when I wrote that book, it was all about going back and explaining the journey of how we got to Henley and talking about the tools, the strategies, the mindset, the approach, all of it, so that a coach could read that and go, "Oh, okay, I've never looked at it that way. I've never talked about love with my athletes before. I've never encouraged them to not only love themselves, but to love each other. We've never had that conversation before. Look what happened when this guy talked about love with his teenage athletes. They became incredibly capable of things they weren't before those conversations." And so, yeah, so it's a. I think first it's a really good story, but obviously I'm biased. But there are a lot of tools in there too, right? There are a lot of how tos, if you will, right?
So it's neatly aligned from a philosophical and also a sort of a technique, a mental technique perspective. I love that. I love those kind of reads. Jason, just thank you so much for sharing this today. Just a fascinating story. And there really are increasingly more and more Olympic athletes. We've had a few on the podcast who are doing great work in this area. Lawrence Halstead, a former fencer, Kath Bishop, a former rower herself, doing some wonderful work like you are to change meaning and change experiences, optimize experiences within Olympic sports. So just wonderful stuff. Jason, I can't thank you enough for today. How can people find you, follow you, get in contact, and as importantly, find your books?
Yeah, yourmindset.ca is our website. So all one word, yourmindset.ca. And then, Amazon Pulling Together is out of print, so we sold out of the book, but it's still available online in EPUB or what have you. I'm in the process of, I've had a lot of people ask for it to be an audiobook, so I'm going to do that. But yeah, and then social media, stuff like that. So just do a search
They'll find you.
and we'll come up. Just quickly, interesting, Dan. Kath she wrote one of the liners in Pulling Together. She's quite a gal, and big fan of her book, big fan of her work. The Long Win
Yes.
and I think it's in its second edition.
Yes.
She's she's a class act all around for sure.
Yeah. Yep. And the same or similar messages coming from Kath, coming from Lawrence, coming from some great
Yes, for
people
sure.
in this area, that there are different ways to experience high performance sport, which I think is wonderful. And introducing ways to incorporate that competitive, combative approach. As you said, I think last thing to say here, Jason, is you're not for one
Right.
minute you suggesting that can't be a part of the experience, and it possibly does have to be for some people some of the time in certain contexts, doesn't it? But it's
Yes.
just it's marinating it in a more person-centered approach.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I don't want to give the impression that every coach is doing it
Yeah,
wrong, right? We've seen a shift, right, in the work that we're doing, in the athletes that we work with. I think, I know this makes me sound like an old fuddy-duddy, but this generation of athletes, they want something different,
mm,
right? The because I said so isn't a good enough reason anymore. And I think they are longing for a different approach.
yeah,
And so I think this approach meets their needs
yeah,
wholeheartedly.
very much. Jason, thank you so much for today.
My pleasure. Absolutely my pleasure. Thank you.
Well, everyone, I really enjoyed that podcast episode, and I'd love to know what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via X or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.